everyone. Today I'm going to be doing a book review on Junji Ito's horror manga, Uzumaki. Now, I picked up this book kind of on a whim. We came by this place called the Manga Hole, which is kind of a small place that had a lot of, manga, obviously, hence the name. And I ran across it. I had heard of Uzumaki before, and Junji Ito, obviously. He's very prolific. Now I want to talk about just kind of my experience reading the book. Obviously this is a review, so I'm going to include spoilers throughout in case you haven't read it and you don't want to be spoiled. You can go ahead and click off the video if that's your choice, but I want to kind of discuss the themes and how I interpreted the story, but also some of the potential flaws that I noted. So Uzumaki was originally a 3-part or perhaps 3-chapter story that I believe was featured in a magazine originally, but then was later compiled into this ultimate collection that I have here. It reads a lot quicker. I think I don't read a lot of manga or like comics in general, so I was kind of pleased with how quickly I was able to, read through it despite the size. I had done a little bit of research about this because I'm kind of just interested in horror media. I suppose I had a phase where I was interested in horror media for a while. So I delved a little bit into his world, into the art, but never so much so that I knew the plot going in. And when I started reading this book, it had a very strong opening. Very atmospheric. The first 2 chapters really kind of gave me that dread and that horror that, I might have been expecting from this book. But as you go on further into the story, the chapters feel kind of separate from each other. They seemed like one-offs that all had a theme about the spiral around them. As someone who's no stranger to spiraling, I figured Junji Ito's Uzumaki would be a great fit for me. But while reading, I found it to be a little less bone-chilling and a little more campy, if that makes sense. Comedy is reliant on a use of tension, and what has more tension than horror? So when the two combine, I think it might create something that's a little more absurd or perhaps unsettling. But for me, when I was reading, I noticed more of the comedy aspect than the horror. And I feel like this was a bit intentional, but at times perhaps it wasn't. Like in the slug chapter or in the hair chapter, when characters were battling with their sentient hair or turning into slugs while only showing up to class on rainy days. A lot in this book didn't quite make sense, like narratively. The only part of the story I think that really made me feel the kind of horror like internally that I think a lot of people might have felt, and I think the main horror in the story, aside from the cosmic terror, is body horror. And the chapter with the ears and the cochlea, the cloaca inside of the ear canal, the part where Suichi's mom was gonna take the scissors to her ears, that part made me cringe. I could feel it in my ears as I was reading the story, even though you don't show it, like you can, that tension, that, imagining what it would feel like was just terrifying. You kind of lose that sense of physicality as the stories get crazier and crazier. There's a lot in this world that doesn't add up that I think you're supposed to attribute to the spiral and to the cosmic horror sense of it. Like the people are being taken over by the idea of the spiral, so they don't notice when things go awry for them normally. But I think it's almost a lazy way to write off the events that are happening, or rather the logic behind why certain things are happening. And I only say that because cosmic horror doesn't strike me quite the way that it might others who might only want to focus on the concepts of the cosmic horror rather than the plot or the characters. Those 2 things were lacking to give way to the concepts and ideas that were present. And that's not to say that they weren't interesting, but I feel like when the point of something is that it's not fleshed out, it kind of leaves a lot of room to, yes, interpretations and theories, of course, but it almost feels like a cop-out to be a little bit lazy with the story. And I get where people are coming from when they say that Junji, he didn't want to focus too much on the characters or anything like that. Or the point wasn't the plot necessarily, but the end goal of this cosmic horror that was infesting this town. But For me personally, as a reader, I find that I could have used a little more connective tissue between these stories themselves, so to speak. That's not to say that you can't think about it and make your own theories and headcanons as to why you figured it made more sense, and who's to say that you're wrong when I think the author invites that. One of my biggest storytelling pet peeves is when readers are made to make their own headcanons about why certain things are the way that they are. I prefer it to all be laid out in the text. It's just not satisfying for me when I have to make up my own resolution. I'm not the writer. That being said, I did really appreciate Ito's use of, I think, the art in his comedy as well. Certain frames were a bit comedic. And you could tell when they were supposed to be, instead of horrifying or, leaving a lasting impression of terror. The art is incredible, and the way that the hyper detail of the gore clashes with, the average everyday images that, that typically start off the story. What he wants to stick out will stick out to you. Now, how would I rate Uzumaki on a score of 1 to 10? Personally, for me, I'd say Uzumaki is more of a 7.5. I found it didn't grip me as a story as much as it did an interesting concept. I watched Murphy Near's video, I believe that's the name of her YouTube channel. She was talking about how Kyrie had a lot of hope, where Soichi had kind of given into this despair, because he had this knowledge of it beforehand. It's not true nihilism in that sense, but I think it's the way that a lot of people might think of nihilism, and that everything is meaningless, and that having the knowledge itself is a burden. I think that represents Soichi very well. Kyrie, I pronounce it Kyrie, not Kiri, I'm not sure how exactly you're supposed to pronounce it, was very hopeful, and there was a lot of moments that I was like, I felt it was almost unrealistic for her to go, and search out for her parents towards the end, or to say that she's going to come back for her brother. But at a certain point, it did become very endearing. The way that she kind of not was unaware, but ignored the fear of it all. She was very much our lens, the audience's lens, the passive observer. But when Murphy made that comment about her being so hopeful and Soichi kind of being her foil, it occurred to me that they're almost like polar opposites, and polar made me think of, magnets and polarity, and how if we're caught between them, it's almost like being stuck in the spiral itself, and how they almost become a metaphor for the spiral. And, the story is ongoing until eventually one of them gives in, and Kyrie is just finally dragged down by the weight of all of this. It almost ends kind of, I don't want to say romantically, but there was a softness to the way that Kyrie kind of gave into it, and that they entwined into themselves, which I recognize harkens back to one of the earlier stories with the two lovers who twist into each other. And I don't think I ended up getting the full impact that I would have had I focused on it more. There's definitely a gap between, let's say, even if you were seeing this on television in a TV show or an anime or a movie, I think there's a lot of empty space when you're reading it, especially in a manga. Your mind has a lot of room to breathe and wander, versus when a book, you're constantly moving over the words. But in the manga, there's a lot of time. You have to make up the timing, the pacing. A lot of that relies on the reader. A lot of the art and some of the storylines they really lent themselves to this idea of absurdity or exaggeration, that I'm not saying I was laughing through the entire book, but I was certainly pausing at some points going, okay. This was written for not an older audience, but this was written in the 1990s. Audience in the 90s, before absurdity for its own sake kind of event, cultural resurgence or emergence have happened, they might have found this stuff terrifying. They might have found it really scary. But that's not to say that it's bad. It's just there are many interpretations that younger people might have of it. There are a lot of moments that were frightening. I'm not writing it off entirely. But as a cohesive whole, it fell short. I don't know if I'm not the right reader for this, or if I wasn't in the right headspace. I would have liked to have liked it more. I'm hoping I'm cohesive in this. But that's kind of where I'm going to leave off, this part of my review. I've got footage of me less kempt than I am now, kind of talking about it, some of the similar things that I found in the book. But Yeah, I mean, I wish I had liked it more than I did. I'm sure Junji Ito has other great works out there that don't rely on a long form narrative. Um, or maybe, they do, but he's done it better. I don't want to come off like I hated the book or that I hated the style or anything, is I think the ultimate thing that I'm coming from. I just think it could have been better had it been expanded upon. But it's at this point that I'll ask you guys, what did you think of the book? If you've read it, would you like to read it? Would you be interested in reading it after this review? Or if I swayed you at all, if you have read it. Not that I'm wanting to, but I don't know. Because, my opinion isn't the end all be all. Also, why aren't you liked and subscribed, bestie? That frame, I think, would make a nice still for Junji Ito's book. you could horror that up. I appreciate you if you did click on this video. You don't have, well, you should, but I would really appreciate it if you did like and subscribe. I'm trying to reach a broader audience with my book and writing related content across multiple platforms. I am an author. And I just appreciate being in this book community a lot, even though I have my gripes with it sometimes. But, I just want to get to know you guys. So if you have any recommendations for books to read in the future, anything like that, any Junji Ito, short stories, simple stories that you would recommend that might be more cohesive in themselves, recommend them down below. I'd really appreciate it, and I love to hear your thoughts and feedback. All right, I'll see you guys later. Don't forget to worship the spiral.